Hi, I'm Tim Fitch, one of your Stratford Crossing neighbors. Over the course of the last several years, I've had quite a few discussions with other residents in our development about our Homeowners Association, or what is simply referred to often as our HOA. These discussions have made me realize that there's a lot of confusion out there about what an HOA is, what it does, and how it works. So I decided to try to put together this little video, which I'm calling Homeowners Association for Dummies. Now, I'm going to ask you to please not take offense. The title is not born from my assessment of the intelligence level of my neighbors. Rather, is it an attempt to ensure viewers that I'm going to do my level best to keep my explanations as simple as possible, which, given my rather simplistic mind, is the only way I can understand this stuff. Hence the subtitle. Anyway, here we go. Okay, now before we go any further, I do feel the need to give a bit of disclosure here. To start with, I am not an attorney. I have never aspired to be an attorney, but I'm pretty sure that based on the research that I've done, most of what I'm about to tell you is accurate. But I'm not going to make any guarantees about that. So for anyone who decides to proceed past this point, you do so at your own risk. During the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to try to cover four separate but related topics. First of all, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what an HOA is. Then I'm going to talk about what a management company is and what role they play with respect to an HOA. Then I'm going to get a little bit more detail into our homeowners association. And then I'm going to lay out a couple questions that I think we as residents need to address. So let's double back to that first question. That being, what is a homeowners association? Well, it is a separate legal entity with its own bank account that provides services to residents of a subdivision, and then it collects fees from the residents to pay for those services. And the fees that it collects goes into that separate bank account, and the payment for those services comes out of that bank account. In addition to providing the services and collecting the fees for those services, it also makes and enforces rules to help preserve and enhance the property values of that community. Okay, that's a bunch of words. Now let's try it with a picture. A homeowners association is simply a separate legal entity that's got its own bank account, and it provides services to the residents of a subdivision. It collects fees from the residents to pay for those services, and then it makes and enforces rules and guidelines to help enhance the property values. Okay, so if this HOA is a separate legal entity, a logical question would be, well, who the heck owns it? Generally, there are no owners per se. The HOA is more often than not a non-stock corporation, and all of the residents, although they are not owners, are members. And I'll get into what that means in a little bit. Okay, so if there's no owners, who actually runs the homeowners association? Well, it is generally run by a board of directors, like most corporations, and that board of directors is initially made up of individuals that are appointed by the developer. But then over time, as the neighborhood matures, it is generally then made up of individuals who are elected by the members, that is, the residents. So what kind of decisions do these directors make? Well, they make some pretty important ones. They're the ones who decide what services will be provided, what vendors are going to be providing those services, what the residents are going to be charged for those services, and what rules and guidelines the residents are going to be subjected to. Now that we've covered the basics of a homeowners association, let's spend a moment or two talking about what a management company is. Well, it's a third party that's hired by the board to provide certain services that the board itself doesn't feel like they're capable of providing. So that would include things like sending bills to the homeowners for their assessment dues, collecting those payments and depositing them into the HOA's bank account, then paying the bills that are submitted by vendors, but the bills that get paid are only those that are approved by the board. The management company often is the one that often keeps the books and provides the financial statements to the board and to the residents. And it often gets involved in helping the HOA find reputable vendors to provide the services that the HOA is interested in providing. And then finally, because they often have a list of all the email addresses and contact information for the residents, they often are the ones that wind up sending communications, important communications, to the homeowners. All right, so that's what a management company does, but I think it's equally important to understand what a management company does not do. And since they are a third party that is hired by the board to help them, it is important to realize that the management company itself has no say in deciding the stuff that the board decides. And that is, the management company does not determine what services will be provided. They do not determine which vendors will provide those services. They don't determine what residents will be charged for the services. And they aren't the ones that determine what rules and guidelines the residents will be subject to. All right, so we have now covered Homeowners Association 101. Now we're going to get into a little bit more about our own homeowners association. So our homeowners association is actually a non-stock corporation. The name of it is the Stratford Crossing Homeowners Association, Inc. It's got its own bank account. It's registered with the Secretary of State in the state of Connecticut, and it provides services to us, the residents of the Stratford Crossing subdivision. It collects fees from us to pay for those services, and it makes and enforces the rules and guidelines, hopefully, to enhance our property values. Okay, just as we did before, we'll do this with a picture now. Our homeowners association is a nonprofit corporation registered in the state of Connecticut called the Stratford Crossing Homeowners Association, Inc. It provides services to the members, the residents of the Stratford Crossing subdivision. It collects fees from them, and then it makes and enforces rules and guidelines to enhance the property values. So then, who is it that runs our HOA? Well, our HOA, as I said, is a corporation that has a set of bylaws. And per those bylaws, there is a board of directors that runs the homeowners association, and they're the ones who make the decisions like, and I think you're going to see this is getting a bit repetitive, but it makes decisions like what services will be provided, what vendors are going to provide those services, what residents will be charged for those services, and what the rules and guidelines are that the residents will be subject to. In a minute or two, I'll get into exactly who is on our board. Before I do that, there's just a couple other basic issues I want to cover. So I mentioned earlier about these bylaws that the corporation has, and you may be wondering, well, what else is covered in these bylaws? Well, it covers things like how many directors should be on the board, how long the term of those directors should be, who gets to vote for those directors, what the rights and obligations of the directors are, how director meetings are to be run, that is, how frequent they're supposed to be held, and what kind of quorum do you need for their decisions to be binding. And in the event that any director positions are vacated, how those vacancies get filled. So that's the kind of things that the bylaws cover. I also just want to spend a minute covering who White Katzman is and what they do. They are the management company that our board hired to provide the kinds of services like sending the bills, collecting the payments, paying the bills that the vendors submit, keeping the books, helping the HOA find reputable vendors, and communicating events to the homeowners. So they are the management company that the Stratford Crossing Homeowners Association has retained. There is one more topic I'd like to quickly cover before we get back to the issue of who is currently on our board, and that is to briefly explain what kind of expenses our HOA fees have to cover and which resident should be paying for which expenses. The first group of expenses I want to chat a little bit about are those that I think are most equitably spread amongst all of the residents, regardless of what area you live in. And those include things like the maintenance of the entrances and the other common areas that the HOA is responsible for. The second one are fees to the management company. The third one is liability insurance for the common areas that the HOA is responsible for. And finally, once we have a board that is comprised of residents, those board members are going to need liability insurance, and so there'll be a cost associated with that. The second set of expenses are those that are most fairly spread amongst the residents of Queens and Londonderry, because it is those residents that get the benefit of these services, and that is the costs associated with plowing and maintaining the private roads that they live on, the maintenance of the islands that are at the end of each of those two streets, and finally, once the decorative street lamps are in place and wired, there's going to be a cost for the electricity for providing the lighting at those devices. And then finally, there are expenses that are only incurred by the residents of Londonderry for the lawn care they get, the garbage pickup, and the snow plowing of their driveways and walks. So because the level of services varies quite a bit depending on what section of the development you live in, so too do the fees. So for instance, for the residents of Stratford Crossing, Lenox, and Beechwood Hollow, they're currently billed, I believe, $325 a year. The folks on Quinns Court are charged $150 a month, and the folks on Londonderry are billed $350 a month. Now, I know this was a little bit of a digression from what we'd been talking about in terms of just general knowledge on the HOA, but because so many of the questions I've gotten over the years have centered on, well, what kind of expenses did the HOA have and how are those spread amongst the residents, I thought I'd spend a couple minutes going over this. But now let's get back to the general question that I deferred earlier in terms of who is on the current board. The board of the Stratford Crossing Homeowners Association currently consists of two individuals. One, the president of our board is Bill Ferrigno, who you may recognize as being the developer and the president of Sunlight Construction. And the secretary and treasurer of our Homeowners Association is Amy Blades, who is a Sunlight employee. For those of you who are paying really close attention, you may be now reflecting back on a slide I showed you a little bit earlier that looked like this. And when I told you that initially the board of an HOA is often initially made up of individuals appointed by the developer, but that as the neighborhood matures, the board is then made up of residents who are elected by the members, that is, elected by the residents. So if that's the case, then you may be wondering, well, certainly our neighborhood is mature, so why the heck is Sunlight still in control of our board? It's a pretty simple answer to that question, although not a very satisfying one. And that is that although our bylaws do give members the right to elect a board made up of residents at our annual meeting, and those same bylaws call for an annual meeting to be held each October, the current board hasn't called for an annual meeting in several years. So it's really tough to have an election at an annual meeting if there is no annual meeting. So as a result, even though we are a very mature neighborhood, our board is still under the control of the developer. Now, there's some good and bad things about that. So let me first cover what the good things are of that, and that is the upsides of not having residents control the HOA. And there are three that I can think of. One is that right now, because they are in control and because of the way they're structured, Sunlight is actually currently covering a few of the costs that eventually we, the homeowners, would have to cover once we get control. And that includes some insurance on the open space that surrounds and kind of inhabits some of our development, as well as liability insurance for the board members. So right now the board members are Sunlight folks, and Sunlight's general liability coverage already covers them. So the homeowners association, our homeowners association today, is not paying anything for any kind of liability insurance for board members, which we would have to pay for once our board is made up of residents. The other thing is currently Sunlight is actually assuming certain liabilities because, for instance, the open space, which eventually is going to be turned over to the homeowners association, is still under the ownership of Sunlight, or at least it was last I looked. And so as a result of that, for instance, if a branch falls off one of the trees in the open space and injures someone, that's on Sunlight, not on the homeowners association. But maybe the most significant benefit is that once we are in control of the board, we have to find residents who are willing to serve on the board and serve in that thankless job of making decisions that inevitably tick off at least half of the residents in the neighborhood. So those are some of the upsides of not having the residents control the HOA. But I think there's a huge downside. And again, this is where you're going to see some of this repetition. As long as we're not in control of the board, we don't have control of our fortunes. That is, we have no say in deciding things like what services will be provided, who's going to provide them, what we're going to get charged for those services, and what the rules and guidelines are that are going to govern this development. So I think we have two fundamental questions that we need to answer. One is, do we want control of the homeowners association? And if so, how do we get it? On that first question of whether or not we want control of the homeowners association, just to summarize kind of the pros and cons, in short, the biggest benefit is that we control our destiny. The biggest downsides is that the fees are probably going to go up a little bit, at least for some of the residents, and that some of the residents are going to need to agree to serve on the board. If we decide we want control of the homeowners association, you might be wondering, well, how do we get it? Well, we have two options. Plan A would simply be to go to the current board and ask them to hold the annual meeting in October. And at that meeting, have the current board members resign and hold an election for the new directors at that meeting. And I should point out at this point, there really is no benefit to Bill and Amy to retain control of the board. They don't benefit financially in any way because all the fees that get collected go into the homeowners association bank account and pay for homeowners association bills. So I don't really understand why they haven't done this yet, but they haven't. And so, but one of the options would simply be to go to them and say, well, we're willing to take the steering wheel. Would you be willing to resign and let us elect a new board? And we could do that at an October annual meeting. So that's plan A. Plan B would be to utilize some options that are available to us as spelled out in the bylaws that actually give us the ability to remove the current directors and elect new ones. In terms of whether we should pursue plan A or plan B, the benefit of plan A is that it's really the easier of the two options to implement, and that if it doesn't work, we still have plan B that we can exercise. The biggest con or downside is that it requires cooperation from Sunlight and Bill Ferrigno, but as I mentioned on the earlier slide, there's really no real benefit to them retaining control. And in fact, there's some potential downside. All right, so I know I threw a lot at you over the course of the last 20 minutes or so, but hopefully you've got now a basic understanding of what an HOA is, some of the issues facing our HOA, and some of the options available to us. The logical question now would be, so where do we go from here? And here's what I'm going to propose. I'm going to try to get a copy of this video out to everybody on my distribution list, which includes about 3/4 of the residents of Stratford Crossing, and give them a couple weeks to view it and digest it. And then with the hope that we can then hold a meeting via Zoom on Thursday, the 2nd of September at 7 p.m., during which we will quickly zip through a presentation similar to this again, just to bring everybody back up to speed on the fundamental issues, give some time for Q&A for some questions that folks might have about the presentation that they weren't able to obviously ask while they were viewing the video, and then get to the heart of two questions, which is one, do we want to move ahead to try to get control of the HOA for the residents? And if so, is our first shot at that plan A or plan B? So stay tuned. I'll be in touch. Thank you for your attention. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a buzz or shoot me an email. My contact information is right here.